Okay, so men in ag and women in ag. Uh, Okay, so what's the vision? If you think back to what life was like before you kind of took over farming, I know for a number of us, I started farming when I was like, I don't know, knee high, right? Like I was really young and I was out there feeding, bottle feeding lambs and things like that. But how did we picture our lives as a farmer? One of the things I remember this vision very clearly. I was standing on a front porch and I had all sorts of kids around. I really wanted to be a mom and I was collecting eggs, and it really was kind of the picture of, of Mrs. Ingalls. Little House on the Prairie was one of my, so I think that's how I envisioned being a farmer's wife would be. I have to admit that is not the reality, folks. It's not the reality at all. But when I think back to what that vision was, did I understand what the requirement of agriculture would place on me as a woman or on my husband as a man? You are the farmer, even if you're not in the primary position. A lot of times I hear farmer wives say to me, well, my husband's a farmer. And I think, wait a minute. I don't know very many husbands that are sole farmers, and your spouse is not a part of the programming, not a part of it. So what were your goals when you began farming, and your goals when you look back those, number of years ago? Have they changed? I think mine was just that we would be sufficient, that we would be able to farm. I did recognize even at that time that it would definitely require an off-farm income to be able to do that for us. And then I think working hard is enough. A lot of times, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, if you just love your kids, it'll be enough. And I think, well, sometimes love is just not enough to make sure everything goes smoothly in life. Like life can be really hard. And love is an incredible, powerful force that God has birthed in us, which is beautiful. But when you think about some of the hardships that farmers have faced, and although they love farming and love agriculture, is that love enough when we face difficult times? Sometimes our vision has to change throughout our careers. The other question I have for you is, have you built your resilience skills? And if you're wondering what resilience is, it's your ability to bounce back. Now, that doesn't mean it goes back to the original form. A lot of times people think, well, resilience, it's when I face a hard trial, something gets taken away from me, but I build it back up. Well, sometimes resilience means that we change in the process. Doesn't mean things are all tickety-boo the way they were before. It means that sometimes it looks different, but we're still able to go on and enjoy and thrive in life. And when you think about those resilience skills, the latest research is very resilient. And I'm surprised by that research. I would say that farmers are very resilient in agriculture, but not so much in mental health. We have to learn to take the skills we know about in agriculture. How have we been resilient in agriculture, and learn to put them into the context of our mental wellness? For some of the statistics, suicide rate for farmers are 2+ times, meaning just over 2 times more likely than the general population. I'm going to talk about suicide for a little bit in these statistics because we cannot avoid the conversation. Now, suicide is immensely painful. It is such a loss for farmers, for our agriculture industry, for families. And it's important to understand that it's not a blame game, it's a tragedy. It's not the family's fault, it's not the individual's fault, it's not anybody's fault, it's a tragedy. And so it's important that we learn to have a great deal of compassion, and that we come to an understanding and have the conversation, because it really is more prevalent than what we want it to be, than what anybody would ever want it to be. But it's more prevalent than most people realize. For instance, last year 1 in 4 farmers, that's 25% of farmers, thought about taking their life, thought about this life is not worth living, excuse me, thought about giving up. 1 in 4 farmers last year after the pandemic. So it's important for us to understand that suicide is becoming, or has become, something that we have ignored for far too long. Now, women are more likely to think about suicide than men. In fact, they're 7 times more likely to think about suicide than men, but men are 4 times more likely to complete it. Now, both men and women in agriculture have fewer attempts before completion, meaning they use more lethal means than urban counterparts, meaning people in agriculture are able to complete complete suicide, die by suicide, with fewer attempts than people living in more urban areas and cities. Now, farm women, they're experiencing high levels of anxiety, high levels of depression and exhaustion, much more so than farm men. Depression is actually twice as prevalent in women than in men. One of the reasons for that we're going to chat about in a bit is that women are typically their partner's sole support, right? Women are much more likely to put themselves last. They won't seek out mental health support unless their spouse does as well, unless they take care of their spouse. And they're often their spouse's sole support, meaning when their spouse is going through a difficult time from a mental health perspective, they're trying to cushion all that they can and support all that they can. And while that is admirable, the dilemma is that we're finding women are in the agriculture sector are really experiencing a great deal of anxiety, a great deal of depression and exhaustion, because they're holding their own mental health concerns and their spouses and their the men in agriculture in their life. I say the spouses oftentimes throughout this presentation. Understand this: if you're working in a family atmosphere with your brothers and your fathers and that sort of thing, the same applies, right? You tend to kind of hold their emotional support for them. Now, for women in agriculture, 30% of farmers in Canada are women. That has steadily increased. Men are more likely to be the primary decision maker, particularly when we're talking about land and expansion and that sort of thing. But farmers are more unhealthy than the general population, and that's both men and women. We're more prone to chronic disease such as cancer, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. We're more prone to those than the urban population. There's a variety of reasons for that. I definitely do not want to sit here and blame it all on spraying, as some people would have you to believe. But what I am saying, for a variety of reasons, for instance, we encounter more barriers to healthcare. We also have stigma in asking for help because we're the salt of the earth, rock. We can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps kind of people, which means we're not very good at looking for support for our own health, both from a mental health perspective and from a physical bodily perspective. One of the other things we see is in rural areas, we have preventative healthcare. So more urban populations, there are more free swim classes, or there's more other types of supports that are available that we wouldn't find in more rural populations. Now, women in ag, as we mentioned, has increased. One of the other pieces to know is men and women are a little bit different as far as the different roles that they play. However, men and women often work off the farm in equal representation. So women are working off the farm with a second or third job, and men are working off the farm with a second or third job. I was talking with Joe Dickinson tonight, and I was talking with him about young farmers. And he said, back in the 80s, when there was such high interest rates, it was really, really hard for farmers. He said, but young farmers now, while we have a lower interest rate, the principal cost of land makes it that we're still juggling so much responsibility that many young farmers are working 2 and 3 jobs besides agriculture besides farming. So it's posing a great risk really to our young farmers. The amount of stress that they are carrying has superseded any year up until this point. So how are we different? I love this verse in Corinthians. It says, nevertheless, meaning nevertheless. That means there's a whole story before that in Corinthians, and you might know what that whole story is, but the writer says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. This means, and Focus on the Family would tell you that while we have different roles, they are not less equal. They are not, one is not better or worse than the other. We are meant to function as a team. We're not independent of one another if you're talking a marital relationship. So either sex alone, this is by William Tennyson, either sex alone is half itself. Each fulfills defect in each other, and always thought in thought, purpose in purpose, will in will they grow. The two-celled hearts beating with one full stroke life. So for those of you who are in a marital relationship, the reality is that we're not independent of one another. We function best as a team. And so part of this presentation is going to talk about that. It is also applicable for those of you who are not in a marital relationship and are farming either on your own or in other partnerships. If you're working with men all the time, know that we all play a role. We have an important role and we complement one another. So I chatted with you about women don't typically seek support without their spouses. They care for others before caring for themselves. Women are often juggling tertiary roles, meaning primary, secondary, and third. So primary, they're primary farming. 2, they're also taking care of the books kind of things, contact direct customers, that sort of thing behind the scenes, and then working off the farm. And in there, the secondary role would be juggling some of the family responsibilities that make for the legacy of agriculture. Men are more likely to make some of the larger decisions, particularly financial expansion, consolidation decisions. They're much more likely to be responsible for some of those larger decisions. So here's the question. When one of you is experiencing mental health difficulties, who's the enemy? Oftentimes what I see in couples and what I see in farming relationships is that within the family there will be a divide, and a wife will blame the husband and the husband will blame the wife. And folks, I want to encourage you that that's not the answer. We ask ourselves, how do we team up together to face the difficulties that happen on the farm? Because difficulties happen on the farm. Understand this, he is not the problem and she is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And if you're not involved in a marital relationship, the problem is not you and the problem is not someone else. The problem is the problem. That doesn't mean we can't change. Doesn't mean we can't learn skills to address the problem, but we don't target one another. We choose to team up together. And the scripture verse from Isaiah 41, I'm sure you know it well. I'm sure you've heard it before. God says, fear not, for I'm with you. In fact, I was talking with a doctor one time who said, well, there's actually 354 times in the Bible where God says to fear not or addresses anxiety. And he says, that's one for every day. I've never validated that, but I would say that fear, I think God talks about it so often in the Bible because he knows our humanness. And we have a tendency to worry. We have a tendency to fear for the future. That's very much the reason why when we read scripture and we say, give us this day our daily bread, right? It's the daily bread. It's not the bread for tomorrow or for next year. It's our daily bread. Give us what we need for today. And so that understanding that is one of the tools in kind of squashing anxiety. When anxiety, we feel like we are having to let somebody else be in charge of our lives, because really that anxiety is in the driver's seat. I challenge people all the time to get anxiety out of that driver's seat. You don't want it in there.
And by farms.com. Ag news, market prices, ag careers, and farm real estate. You'll find it all at farms.com.
Today we're going to talk about the dangers of marriage when farming is put ahead of the marriage. A farm woman shared this letter with me that she wrote to her husband after he asked her for a divorce. She wrote, "I think back to that first conversation I had with my lawyer when all of this began, and I told him, my husband wants a divorce. One of the first things he asked me was, does he have someone? And without even thinking, I blurted out, yes, the farm. I guess that's what it's all about. It all boils down to for me. I felt for many years like I've been second or even third or fourth place in your life. I feel like the farm has become your mistress, one thing that gives you more joy in life than I ever can." Too many farm wives share this experience. The farm occupies their husband's devotion and interest, and very few of their needs get met in the process. How can farmers keep their marriages alive and still do a good job at farming? Here are some points to consider. It's important to put the marriage first ahead of the farm, except for those special times of seeding and harvesting. Don't worry, farm women understand farming and accept the realities of the weather and other problems. Marriage also needs affection, intimate conversation, recreational companionship, openness, family celebrations, and a commitment to family and domestic support, just as the soil needs tillage and fertilizer. Also, farm women want the feeling of being equal and respected and to be included in major decisions, not just playing second fiddle to the farm. Here's my advice to farmers who want to keep your marriages strong. Don't throw away your love and your marriage for something that has no life and can't love you back. Put loving and pleasing your wife ahead of the farm, and the farm will do okay. This is Dr. Val Farmer for Mind Over Matter.
Now, folks, I would challenge you. He makes it sound like it's kind of the bad guy for the male farmer. I've seen lots of women do the same. I've seen lots of women pouring everything they can into the farm and neglecting the relationship as well. So watching that video, I'm kind of like, there's a little bit of in me, because it really is both, right? One's not the enemy over the other. It's both of you choosing to put that relationship first. Okay, so for those of you who aren't in a marriage relationship, the rest of this applies equally. So I hope I haven't lost you in there. Build communication. How do you build communication? Number one, we get curious. Right? So we learn to ask words and statements such as, well, help me understand, or tell me about. A lot of times we use a lot of closed-ended questions. Did you have a good day? Are you going outside after supper? Right? We use a lot of closed-ended questions. They don't encourage discussion. Therefore, they don't encourage relationship. And so long as you have relationship, you have influence. And we want to have influence over one another because we are operating as a team. That is the goal. So in order to build relationship with other people, you want to get curious. And make sure you understand what the other person is saying. If you're in the office and somebody says to you, oh my goodness, those Toronto Maple Leafs are terrible. And you say, oh, does that mean that you hate the Calgary Flames? Well, no, that's not what the person said at all, right? You want to make sure that you're actually understanding what are they trying to say. So it's interesting to me too, because a lot of time this past summer, I had so many people say to me, oh, it's just been such a beautiful summer. We've had beautiful weather. And I'm thinking, not if you were trying to grow something. It wasn't beautiful weather for us. And so anyway, it's obvious that little caveat, right, with agriculture. Okay, and the last point, this part is really, really important. If you don't take away anything else from tonight, I want you to learn to understand this skill. Okay, so key in here, folks. It's called validation. Now that sounds like another kind of generic term. Validation means I come into a form of agreement with you. It doesn't mean I agree with everything you say. It doesn't mean I agree with everything you do. It means that I'm hearing you and I'm giving you credit for how you're perceiving a situation. So I'll give you an example. When my husband and I first moved to our first farm, We're first generation farmers, although we both came from an agricultural family. So my husband's family had a lot of experience in potato industry and PEI. I grew up on a hobby farm in Sombra, but we were still first generation farm. And when we brought our sheep to the farm for the first time, my husband and I would go to try and do some chores together. And it didn't take before kind of at each other's throats. We were just irritated very easily. And so it got to the point where he would go to do his chores because he does all the kind of bigger grunt work. I only drove the tractor once when we first started farming, and I hit the side of the barn with the tractor. And so I don't know if it was slightly intentional so that I'd never have to drive the tractor again, which didn't work. I've driven it many times since. But anyway, what I found out is he would go out and do his grunt work, and then I would go out and do kind of the more veterinarian kind of care of the animals. So I'd be responsible for a lot of the labor and delivery and, you know, weaning and the growing of the lambs. And so one day we figured out what was missing. And I'm so thankful we figured this out. So I'm hoping I help other people figure it out sooner. We were both looking for the same thing. You know, did you know there's 2 different ways to carry a gate? There's 2 different ways to spread straw. There's 2 different ways to put hay into a manger. There were 2 different ways thing. And we finally realized that we were both looking for the same thing, and that's called validation. He was looking for me to say, wow, honey, you do this really well. You're really smart with this farming thing. And I was looking for him to say the exact same thing. I was looking for him to say, honey, you really know this sheep business. You're really good with caring for these animals. You see, that's called validation. If I went outside and I looked up at the sky and I said, wow, what a big, beautiful blue sky. And somebody else went outside and looked at the sky and they saw a pink sky. They have 2 options. They can say to me, Loren, you're nuts. That's not a pink sky. That's a blue sky. Or they could say to me, wow, look at that color. Isn't that amazing? It's just beautiful. You see, the second one is validation. You come into a form of agreement. You don't necessarily agree with everything, but you come into a form of agreement with the other individual. That's validation. And it's absolutely critical in every relationship, not just a marital relationship. If you're in a business relationship with someone and your coworker has a new idea, you want to learn to validate that idea. If you're in a multi-generational farm and a younger member of your farming family has a new idea with technology, you have a choice. Either say, no, we've done it this way for 100 years, we're going to keep doing it. Or say, tell me about that. You're really smart. Let me understand more of what this technology could bring us. That's the goal. And that's validation. In my opinion, it is the most important skill you could develop when it comes to relationship. I've got a case study here. I don't know if we have time to go through it, so we might come back to it. Let me see. We'll go ahead and go through it. John and Brandy have both been busy. Brandy works as a nurse 40 hours a week and works on the farm about 12 hours doing the books. John works full-time on the farm and as a side gig, custom work 15 to 20 hours a week. Number one, what does that tell you about this family? What I see in that is, yes, they're both very busy. They're both committed to the farm. But one of the things you notice also, John is quite isolated on that farm because even though he's working full-time on the farm, he's also, his custom work generally means he's not around and chatting with a lot of other people. So he's working up to 60 hours a week pretty well by himself, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they've decided to make dating a priority. Brandy arranges the babysitter, make sure the kids have supper and the emergency contact information. They get in the car and John asks Brandy, so where do you want to go? Does anybody know the phrase there? Well, so what do you want to do tonight, honey? Because her response is going to be, whatever you want to do, dear. And then he's going to say, I really want to go to Eastside Mario's. And she's going to be like, fine. And she'll be silent for a while because she wanted to go to anywhere but Eastside Mario's. Right? That seems to be a pretty clear pattern. The reason I wanted to draw your attention to this is because if he's working off the farm and so isolated, and she's got a very stressful job working as a nurse and pouring into the farm, communication is probably not really effective or not happening enough, which means we have a lot of misunderstandings. Even when we're like, okay, dating's going to be a priority, I've lined everything up, and yet something typically goes wrong in those moments. So what do we need to do differently? Here's your goal. It's to actually say how you're feeling, to say what you need. We don't do this very well as farmers. We have this thing called this rug. We like to hold it up, sweep a bunch of crud underneath it, and then we let that rug fall down and hope that all the crud underneath gets cleared up. It doesn't work. And so in this situation, it seems really trivial, but the reality is in those moments, John needs to be able to say, I'm really exhausted. Can we just go to the movies and veg? Right? Or maybe he's really like, you know what? I just miss talking to people. Can we just go somewhere and sit down and talk? And Brandy needs to say, I'm happy to go anywhere with you so long as we don't go to Eastside Mario's. No offense to Eastside Mario's, by the way. We had it the other night. It was really delicious. Right? So in this case study, this example, remember earlier I talked about communication. I talked about validation, clarification, and open-ended questions. The last point of that is sharing how you feel. So on our farms, men and women, we want to build flexibility. What do we each do well? A lot of times in our world, we are taught that whatever your weakness is, whatever your failure point is, or the area you struggle, you want to build that area and bring about its strengths. I'm not sure that I always agree with that. Because a lot of times our strengths can grow and build and kind of compensate for some of those areas that we struggle. So on the farm, building some flexibility. What are you good at? What is the other partner good at? What is the other person good at? And grow those areas. Is it okay to alter the roles and incorporate some of the other person's strengths? So my strength is not driving a tractor. I think I have a depth perception issue. It is not my strength. But my strength is flipping over sheep. I'm pretty good at it. I can flip them over real good, and I can trim those hooves real good. My husband will drive the tractor. I will trim sheep. I will trim the toes. Right? It's okay to build upon those strengths. If my strength was driving the tractor and my husband's was cooking and baking bread and, you know, delivering lambs and administering antibiotics or whatever that is, we have the flexibility to shift. That's a good thing. Grow your strengths, emphasize those strengths and build those as much. It's okay to look at our areas where we struggle and grow those as well, but don't be afraid to say, you know what, I'm really good in this area and I'm going to, you know, grow and flourish in this area. All right, we want to build intimacy. Are you roommates or are you teammates? Unfortunately, I work with a lot of young families. I work with a lot of young couples, and they are roommates and not teammates. They can function well as far as roles and responsibilities and dividing them up, but teammates look different, especially if you're really united on something. I was actually listening to a chat today. It talked about in relationships, you can have tea with one another, meaning you kind of flit together and you go do your own thing. And you just come together to have tea and then you go off and do your own thing. Or you can be like two streams that run parallel to each other, meaning you just both operate like roommates. You do your own life together. Or you can be like birds who come and they eat together and they grow together and they build their nests together, and all of those pieces are done together. Our goal on our farm and in our families is to do things together, to build our team together. What does intimacy in your relationship means? Can you carve out time for just the two of you? Can you share your deepest pieces of yourself in safety with the other person? Now, sometimes it doesn't feel safe to do that. Oftentimes it doesn't feel safe to do that if we're so busy and we're stressed and we've got so much on our plate that we don't even allow ourselves to slow down enough to become, to be a safe place for the other person. So carving out that time, focusing that time is really critical. All right, we're going to move on to coping strategies. I'm just going to check the time here. Coping strategies. When would you guys say that life is stressful right now, right? For farmers, according to studies, it's very stressful for farms and for farmers and for farm families, right? There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of depression. There's some really difficult, trying times from a financial perspective. So we've got to learn how to cope well. I would say years ago, we actually had a built-in kind of coping mechanism in a way. We had a sense of community that is different than what we see now. When was the last time when you went out for dinner and you looked at the table next to you and everybody had their phones out and they were just scrolling, right? We have lost our sense of community. When I was a young girl, I was fortunate enough that my mom was a stay-at-home mom. That's not the plan for everybody. It's not possible for everybody, but I was really fortunate that way. And we would go over to a lady's house and there would be 4 or 5 ladies and all their kids would come over and they'd all play. And there was a built-in coping strategy within that because we spent time with one another. We shared with one another. We learned from one another. Time with people is a really effective way to get rid of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. And we have to get rid of it. Otherwise, it leads to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. I'm going to go over some of the ways to get rid of it in just a minute, but we're going to go back to these coping strategies. The number one thing I want to mention, excuse me for my voice. The number one thing I want to mention is we have to chat about alcohol. In our ag communities, alcohol is almost an accepted practice, an acceptable coping strategy. It has unfortunately led to substance use and misuse and abuse. And that has left some farmers with a lack of motivation to see things change. And they feel those feelings of hopelessness and helplessness even more so. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying, oh my goodness, every drip of alcohol is wrong. What I'm saying is it's not a helpful coping strategy. So if you notice yourself popping open a tall boy in order to cope with a stressful day, it's time to kind of come up with a different plan. It's time to talk to somebody, come up with a different plan. For those of you who like to use big muscles, that is a fantastic coping strategy. If you like to chop wood, that's fabulous. If you like to go out and turn over the sod and pull weeds, especially pig weeds. I don't know if any of you have been pulling pig weeds this summer, but man, they thrived in that drought. Everything else needed a little extra water, but that pigweed, it did really well. It's a little bit of a struggle, right? Swing that sledge. Do whatever it takes to use up those big muscles. It's really a fantastic coping strategy. As we talked about earlier, we want to break up with isolation. It is easy as a farmer to stay on our farm because there's so many needs on that farm. And to leave the farm is going to cost you money because somebody's going to want to eat out. It's going to cost gas to get there. And so there's an expense associated with leaving the farm. What we know is that isolation is leading farmers to experience a greater degree of mental health distress. It feels okay for a period of time, but eventually that isolation actually creeps in to our own mental well-being. It's okay to let other people in. In fact, it's one of the really helpful ways of dealing with chronic stress is spending time with other people, hearing that you're not alone. How many of you have ever been to like an agricultural get-together? Right? The Ontario Outdoor Farm Show, maybe. or a convention of some sort with CFFO? Did you find a sense of camaraderie? Was there a sharing? I was at a restaurant not very long ago, and these two farmers were chatting, and I was really kind of smiling to myself because they were talking about their contracts and their forward contracts. They were talking about agriculture, but there was this sense of camaraderie, this sense of kind of bearing one another's burdens because we're in it together. So we want to break up with isolation. The other piece I want to chat with you about is the stigma that farmers face around getting themselves out of the pile of muck. Now, the old term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Has anybody ever heard that term? Right? The reason that term was created was to almost make fun of. It was meant as a joke, nearly, because it's actually impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can't actually do that. And as farmers, we tend to think we can do that. We tend to think that if we just hang on to and we get ourselves up enough, we'll be okay. Now, have any of you ever gotten your boot stuck, in manure? And I'm talking about you've got these tall manure boots up to your knees almost, and you're stuck mid-calf. Have you tried to get out of that very easily? I mean, I'll be curling my toes and wiggling and trying to release an air pocket underneath there. It's almost impossible. And sometimes I'm not too afraid to admit that I have left my boot back in the pile and decided to find a different way into the house. What's easier? Trying to pull yourself up or somebody coming and lending a hand to you? Which is easier? Is it okay to lend a hand to one another? Is it okay to accept a hand? We're not nervous about asking our neighbor to help us fix our planter, but we're really nervous about telling our neighbor that we're struggling with sadness or stress. It's impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but what's not impossible is reaching out a hand to one another and accepting that. I talked earlier about that sweeping method, right? Can't tell you the number of farmers where I'm like, well, let's peel back that rug a bit, shall we? And their response is generally like, no, that's a big pile underneath there. Yeah, it is. How do we prevent that? We start addressing it. Too often as farmers, we say, well, we'll just get by. Well, we'll make it. Well, we can think better thoughts and more happy thoughts and it'll be better tomorrow. No, you know what? It's hard and it's painful and it's okay to step back and recognize that. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is to learn to pay attention on purpose. This is not some new age anything. This is simply a mindfulness technique where you pay attention to something on purpose. In fact, it's really a form of worship. When we go outside and we pick a soybean plant and we study that plant and we notice the texture, we notice how it feels, how it smells, how it tastes, and we worship our God, our creator who created that soybean in that process. That's what paying attention on purpose looks like. For some of the farmers I've worked with, it means they go and they watch their cows for a while before they start doing chores, or they watch their lambs run back and forth having lamb races before they do the chores. Paying attention on purpose is noticing the air. In the wintertime, have you ever noticed your breath as it comes out, especially some of you who live in more northern populations, right? Northern areas. You get to really see your breath there. When we lived in Red Lake, Ontario, when it was minus 50, it was like that quintessential, the smoke rose straight from our chimney because it was so cold and yet it was so still, there was no wind. I remember those moments because I paid attention on purpose. And that when I go outside, sometimes I take a deep breath and release it and you watch your breath. That's paying attention on purpose. It's a great coping strategy. All right, I want to chat with you about the 3 most basic ways to get rid of cortisol. There's actually 4, so I'll mention the 4th, but it's not really too helpful for most of us. So number one is exercise. Actually, I have these in reverse order. It's exercise. Number one is exercise. It is the most helpful way of getting rid of cortisol. Both an intentional, meaning I'm going to go for a walk, and when somebody says, hey, do you want to go for a hike, or do you want to go? So both planned and kind of recreational. It's really, really helpful. I'm sure everybody knows that. Number two, an ugly cry. Can anybody describe for me what you think an ugly cry would look like? But do you think an ugly cry is a little tear coming down your cheek?
No.
No, it's not. It's when your eyes are all swollen, the goobers are mushing around, and when you talk, the saliva sticks to the bottom of your mouth and the roof of your mouth at the same time. I mean, it's an all-in ugly cry. That is so healthy. It is such a good thing to have an ugly cry. Not every day, but it is a great way to release cortisol. I was working with a farmer one time, and he was really quite nervous, and I was kind of like, what's up? Something's up. And he's like, well, Lorena, I think, we really need to talk about something. I just don't know what to do. I don't know if I need to go talk. I need medication. I said, oh my goodness, like, tell me about what's going on. And he said, well, last week I went out to my truck and I cried. And he said, and then this week, just a couple of days ago, I did it again. And I'm like, that's fantastic news. Congratulations. That's great. And he's, of course, confused, but this gentleman had stress in his life. And I mean, not just a little bit of stress. There was stress on all sides, between livestock and health and children's behavioral stuff and all sorts of multi-generational, like there was stress on, and any facet of his life that you could think, there was stress. And so that ugly cry was a really healthy way to just let it go. And thirdly, as we mentioned earlier, is time with others, right? That's a fantastic coping strategy. So folks, that brings us to the end of this presentation. I always like to leave room for conversations, for chats. Did you get a good picture about the differences between men and women in agriculture? Did you find that helpful?
Yes.
Awesome.